notes, don't turn off the lights. I'm blind. I won't be able to read this. First of all, my name is Paul Herodakis. I'm the director of the School of Communication Studies, and want to be the first one to thank you all very much for joining us tonight to hear our keynote speaker, a visitor from the Pulitzer Center. This is part of our Global Issues Forum. It's called. I can never remember the right name. Global Issues Forum. Just as a way of a little bit of background, the Global Issues Forum we formed really established it in conjunction with our undergraduate and graduate degree programs in global communication. The global communication programs are designed to provide educational background to students who are interested in working in global industries, global organizations, really employment in any variety of contexts that require sensitivity in intercultural communication. Most importantly, the curriculum is designed to stress the centrality of communication in globalization, the centrality of communication in identifying, contemplating, and ultimately addressing issues of global concern. And it's the latter that the Global Issues Forum really pertains to, the identifying of those issues. It's jointly sponsored by the Pulitzer Center in Crisis Reporting, which the School of Communication Studies partners as part of its Campus Consortium. We bring each year journalists from around the world to discuss with us issues of global importance upon which they've been reporting that oftentimes are really receiving insufficient attention by the mainstream media. And so tonight, the School of Communication Studies welcomes Beenish Ahmed. Ms. Ahmed, Pulitzer Center journalist's presentation is entitled Women and Children in Crisis. It examines the consequences that occur when women and girls are impoverished, denied an education, and oftentimes become victims of domestic violence. A little bit of background for Beenish. Beenish currently is based in Washington, D.C., covering international issues for Think Progress. Before making the move to Washington, D.C., however, she spent some time, particularly a good bit of time in Pakistan, with a grant from the Pulitzer Center, reporting on a variety of issues. She's been a Kroc Fellow in National Public Radio for its nationally syndicated flagship shows. In addition to stories airing around the world, her work has also appeared in The Atlantic, Vice, Foreign Policy, The Daily Beast, The American Prospect, Global Post, Boston Review, Amal South Asia, Medium, The Huffington Post, and a number of others that she said don't continue to mention the long string tonight. She's also a frequent analyst for breaking news, breaking events for Sky News. As a Fulbright scholar, she studied in the United Kingdom, earning a Master's of Philosophy in Modern South Asian Studies from the University of Cambridge. Her dissertations charted the political and national identity formation among Indian students who went to England in the early 1900s to serve the British Raj, ultimately, though, ended up becoming torchbearers for India's independence movement. She also graduated with highest honors from the University of Michigan with degrees in political science as well as creative writing and literature. I think, if nothing else, her background demonstrates that some of the best, finest journalists working in the world today do not necessarily have their degrees in journalism, but in really broad liberal studies, such as those that we provide in communication studies. Numerous award winners, awards. I'll keep it short now, and it's just my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce to you Beenish Ahmed.
Thank you, Paul, for that gracious introduction, and thank you all for making time to come out and see me on a Tuesday evening right after your spring break. And I also want to just say thank you to the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting for supporting my work in Pakistan and supporting the work of so many journalists who report on issues that don't often make the headlines, that are not the plane crashes and some of the more grisly occurrences around the world, but are long-standing, long-simmering issues that are impacting people's day-to-day lives on a really broad scale. the issue that I covered through the Pulitzer Center was education in Pakistan, which of course became very important and attracted headlines after the attack on Malala Yousafzai, which was something that I sort of used as my impetus to look at education, but found that education is a far more problematic issue, and that some of the concerns about education are not limited to militancy in Pakistan. So we all now know of Malala Yousafzai. We know of her as a remarkable young woman, and indeed she is a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize at a extraordinarily young age. But in Pakistan, she has a very different reputation, and that's something that I found throughout the 2 years that I spent there. Whenever I would tell people that I was looking at education, reporting on education, and that I was writing a bit on Malala, people would always ask me, so what do you think about Malala? And then I would sort of like say something like off the cuff, and they would be like, but what do you really think about her? And what they were getting at is this phenomenon of just a great interest in how she came into the public spotlight, and some ideas about why she came to earn that spotlight. So it all began with her diary for the BBC, which she wrote while Swat was occupied by the Taliban. And so this is an excerpt from that diary where she wrote, "On my way home from school, I heard a man saying, 'I will kill you.' I hastened my pace, and after a while I looked back if the man was still coming behind me. But to my utter relief, he was talking on his mobile phone and must have been threatening someone else over the phone." And so she was talking about her day-to-day fears, her day-to-day issues, and how, for instance, she and her classmates would go to school not in their school uniforms, which are ubiquitous across Pakistan, but in everyday streetwear, so as not to draw attention to themselves, because going to school became something that was, a threat on their lives. And then subsequently she was featured in a New York Times documentary, and then of course she was attacked, which became something of fodder for a lot of conspiracy theories in Pakistan. And I like to say that conspiracy mongering is sort of a national pastime in Pakistan, and a lot of people sort of started to point to this idea that perhaps Malala Yousafzai wasn't killed, attacked by the Taliban, but rather that this was part of a broader movement in order to sort of try to justify an enhanced military campaign in the northern regions of Pakistan beyond the drone strikes that were already occurring there. And so we saw things like this go viral on social media that imply, of course, that the United States was perhaps behind staging an assassination attempt on Malala for its own designs. And then there were things like this that questioned how perhaps she was killed, that there was a lot of stuff about looking at where the bullet entered, how she could have possibly survived, and people began to suggest that perhaps this was sort of a ploy by her own family to gain asylum in the West, and that's what was behind it. But really, unfortunately, some of this attention to me seemed misappropriated, because education and girls' education are serious issues in Pakistan and have been for a long time, even before militancy took root in Pakistan. There were a lot of girls who are not getting educated in Pakistan, and the issues were, and so I wrote about some of these issues for Himmel South Asia and for a number of other publications. But to me, I find it interesting because, as I was saying, education has been a problem in Pakistan for a long time. Girls' education has been a problem in Pakistan for a long time. Getting girls to school has been a problem for decades. And some of these issues are not the sort of striking issues that we see make headlines. They're not about, militant gunmen and bombings of schools and the sorts of kind of sieges that we saw in a school in Peshawar just a few months ago that left, more than 100 students and teachers dead, but rather things like schools don't often have basic sanitation facilities. Girls tend to drop off and drop out after they reach puberty because they can't go to schools that don't have functioning toilets. So these aren't the sorts of issues that maybe grab headlines, but they're issues that affect millions of children in Pakistan, up to 20 million, the UN estimates, who aren't getting an education beyond the primary level. And so I met this one girl. I went out to a village where I heard that there used to be a school, but that it had shut down, And I went there to explore and find out why this school had shut down and what its effects were. This is in a very remote area in a province called Punjab. And I met this one young woman who was, as far as I could tell, the only young woman who was continuing to get an education beyond class 5, which is when, because there was a co-ed school, but beyond that, education becomes segregated by gender. And so beyond that, girls would have to travel, about an hour to on motorcycle or by car or bus to go to school. And Uzma Ahmed was one of the only girls in her village who was doing that and she said that there was a madrasa, an Islamic seminary, that came up after this school was shut down, but that's not the kind of education she wanted. She wanted to go to a proper school and, incidentally, become a teacher, which I thought was really interesting because there were a lot of teachers in this town. It's just that this school was shut down, and I spent a long time figuring out why it was shut down, and it was sort of this bureaucratic mess that I unpacked and led and traced back all the way to Lahore, the provincial capital. But it was like one school shuts down and all of a sudden there's a generation of girls who aren't getting educated, even though the generation above them has master's degrees in education and are perfectly ready and willing to teach. And so it was really striking to see that. And so this is a story I reported on that case. It was for PRI's The World. And another I'm just going to kind of lay out some of the work that I've done, and then maybe we can chat about it to some degree afterward. But sort of what it interested me is just like the opportunities that are available and what happens in spite of sort of these the pernicious problems of society that, for instance, prevent girls from traveling an hour to get to school, or prevent people who have sort of alternative gender identities from becoming fully functioning members of society. And so one thing that I think is fascinating generally is that Pakistan, which is a society, as I said, that has really rigid gender binaries, there's separate schools for girls and boys after the grade 5. So this is something that's pervasive throughout society, and yet there's an established place for people who are transgender. Pakistan is a country that identifies people as quote-unquote third gender, who identify neither as male nor female necessarily. And but despite that allocation, it's still sort of difficult and problematic to be third gender. You aren't necessarily given the sorts of economic opportunities or social acceptance that would allow you to be a fully functioning member of society. But there are places that this community, third gender community, the hijras, as they're called in Pakistan, have found a place. And I was interested in following them and finding what that place is in a city like Peshawar, which has been racked by militancy for at least the last decade, probably beyond. And where there are sort of very rigid ideas of social conservatism and gender norms. And the Hijra population can be seen in many cities across Pakistan, in most of the provincial capitals. And they are sort of people who come, who are given this rather auspicious place in society where they're called upon to dance and celebrate the birth of children, or to perform at weddings, and sometimes even are given a little bit of money to pray for people because of their sort of distinct place in society due to their sort of alternative gender identity. And yet in Peshawar, they were really hard to spot. And so I was really curious about whether they existed in the city and how they lived in the city, and what they were doing and how they were getting by if they were there. And I also was wondering if perhaps the city just isn't accommodating to them, or maybe the predominant ethnicity in the city, Pathans or Pakhtuns, are not, as connected to the Hijra phenomenon as maybe other cultures across the country are. But I started asking around. I started asking people who traverse the city daily, drivers and bus drivers and the like, and I came to find that somebody mentioned to me that there was like sort of one building that this driver had come across where he saw a lot of Hijras gathering sort of early in the mornings. And so I just went out there, I just spent the day and went out there, and they welcomed me into what they called their office, which is where they prepare for performances. And I watched them as they sort of went through this transformation, because they don't move about necessarily all dressed up like this. And I wasn't sure what I was expecting or what I thought I would hear from them. But one thing that I found fascinating was that despite the fact that they occupy this alternative space in terms of gender, they conform to some of the basic constructs of society in terms of familial, social norms. And so they've established social networks and kinship bonds of their own. And so Khushbu, this woman in black on the phone right now in this photo, said that she, left her home of Karachi, a port city in the south of Pakistan, when she was very young, and found a sort of group of hijras who took her in Peshawar, and then now has sort of perpetuated that and taken in this other woman who we see in this rust-colored outfit as her own daughter. And so I sat there and she was telling me about this, and she said, in this field we have mothers, we have gurus, we have uncles and aunts. And she said, pointing to her daughter, who was at that moment rolling a spliff in the corner of the room, and she said, she's my daughter and I'm the daughter of someone, so she has a grandmother too. And Khushbu said she also has a father, because Khushbu has a husband who is a heterosexual man and someone who has another wife, because polygamy is legal in Pakistan. And while while she has this formal marriage to another individual, she's afraid that she won't be honored by him in sort of her last rites. That was something that she was concerned about, that she told me about, and while he supports her economically as sort of a traditional husband might in Pakistan, there are moments where she can't live out in the open with him and have an open relationship with him. And so that was something that I found fascinating, and because families are sort of the kernel of society in Pakistan, they have a really important place, and without a family, one is really nothing. And so it makes sense that even though often run away from their families, often been shunned by their families, as unfortunately so many transgender young people in America have similarly sort of been ostracized and have run away, they've established bonds of their own to replace those. And that was something that I thought was worth noting. Another aspect to this that sort of shifts what we think of for a country like Pakistan, which seems on the surface to be, very conservative, but yet has made space for people who don't meet pretty conservative ideas of social identities. So, but Khushbu also told me that, she has dealt with this her entire life, and while the men in her neighborhood, the boys in her neighborhood, would spend their days playing cricket in the alleys, that wasn't something that she was ever inclined to do, and instead she would sneak away in those moments and try on her sister's clothes. And told me that although she was born in a man's body, she felt that her soul was a woman. And that's something that we've heard parallels to in news media with transgender young people talking about their own gender identities. And so I thought that that was an interesting connection to draw, because these are, in the end of the day, people are people, and these same issues exist across the world. And so she was talking about how she decided to maintain her life as a hijra, and has become really successful as a dancer and sort of manages this troupe of dancers. But she told me, even if I give up dancing, everyone will still call me a hijra, so what's the point? Why not just do what I love? And then she added that even if she were to become a traveling evangelist, her family would still regard her with the same disdain. And so she said, I'm better off staying a hijra, and noted to me that when she goes back to see her family, she goes back dressed as a man and sees that as cross-dressing instead of her day-to-day existence. So that just speaks to some of the same issues that she deals with, wanting to maintain kinship with her own family, her biological family as well. And so that was a story that I reported for Vice not too long ago. And so beyond Pakistan, I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the reporting that I've done elsewhere. And one story that was particularly harrowing and surprising for me as a journalist was a phenomenon that I found just in talking to somebody who was a health worker with the United Nations, based in southern Malawi. And she mentioned something when we were talking about maternal health and about care for young mothers, and she said something about initiation. And I didn't really know much about that, so I said, tell me more. And so it led into this whole thing where she told me that initiation is a phenomenon and that exists across much of sub-Saharan Africa, and in southern, and has various manifestations and various sorts of cultural, it's different in different cultures. But in southern Malawi, oftentimes it takes place for young girls before puberty, and it's sort of young girls will be taken off to kind of a hut outside of their villages and kept there by local women, with village elders, who will teach them about sex and kind of train them on how to have sex and have girls model how to have sex. And Grace Mossy was a girl I met who was 10 years old when this happened, and she told me, they taught us how you can handle a man. She said, looking down at her hands, so you should be dancing for the man. You should be on top. The man should be on top of you, and you should be dancing for him, making him happy. And that she was taught about sex through dance, and that girls were made to model this so that they would learn about this act, and that they were very unaware of at that point. You can imagine a 10-year-old. After I was told about this phenomenon, I made it my mission to find someone who would talk to me about it, because whenever I mentioned it to sort of healthcare workers, to nurses, to others that I came across, they would sort of like laugh it off and not be willing to talk about it. And then I found Grace Mossy, who was willing to talk about it, and not only that, but willing to do something about it. And just to add a little bit of context here, this, as you can imagine, is a devastating phenomenon, honestly, like a heartbreaking phenomenon. And just to add to that devastation is the fact that a quarter of all girls under the age of 18 in Malawi are mothers. Nearly 1 in 500 suffer from obstetric fistulas, which is, this gruesome reality that happens for women who give birth outside of sort of like conventional, maybe without like really effective healthcare systems, and don't receive the care they should at childbirth, and oftentimes for girls who are really young when they give birth, and their bodies just aren't equipped to handle the burden of bearing a child, and so they'll have a tear up their birth canal, and often it leads to incontinence. And you can just imagine the social stigma that results from not being able to control your bowel movements. And so while it is reparable in some cases, there are surgeries, they're expensive, they're hard to come by, and so for women in rural Malawi, it's sometimes a reality that they are forced to live with. And so this is a phenomenon that leads into that. And also, 1/10 of the population in Malawi is HIV positive. It's one of the highest rates of HIV in the world. And so this practice of initiation is feeding into really all three of these realities of really young births, of obstetric fistulas, of the phenomenon, the epidemic of HIV. And there are some people like Grace who are standing up to it, and that was really remarkable to see, because these are girls, like Grace, as young as 14, who are now going to their village elders and saying, we don't need to learn about this, and we certainly don't need to learn about sex at the age of 10. And so they've developed an alternative curriculum, if you will, on what to talk about. And so they insist now on talking about safe sex practices, on talking about appropriate ages at which to have sex, talking about when the time comes, how to get effective care and how to combat some of these pernicious cultural problems. In Malawi, in this part of Malawi, in southern Malawi, there's also a tradition where young women are told not to tell people that they're pregnant, to keep that hidden. And what that means is that, they sometimes they don't get prenatal care. They're not doing what they ought to do to get prenatal care, and they're continuing to do hard labor oftentimes and cause harm to their own bodies and to their fetuses as well. And so these girls are really toppling the power dynamics in these areas, standing up to village chiefs, who we met one of them who was actually doing great work, but and accommodating to this, but village elders who walk about in like lion's manes, who wield a lot of power, and who are not used to having little girls come up to them and tell them how they ought to run things. They've inherited power, they've held it for generations, And so it's toppling not only these sort of gender constructs, but just power structures and class structures in that area. And it was really powerful to meet this group who's led by Faith Fury, this woman in black in the center, and really just remarkable grassroots level ways to stop this phenomenon. So this was I took some of these stories and the story of grace and faith and wrote up this article for The Atlantic. And just talk a little bit more about some work that I did in Pakistan again, and maybe some more heartwarming stuff, because I know a lot of the work that I do is it's pretty sad stuff. It's just I was talking to some classes about this today in the morning, like 11 a.m., and it's just like, good morning, cruel world. Like, there's so much to grapple with. And so I was really excited and happy to be able to report on the work of Musarat Misbah, who runs a chain of high-end beauty parlors across Pakistan, beauty salons. And, is someone who styles models, who appears on talk shows and gives beauty tips, and is a really recognizable face across the country. For a time, she was even an actress and appeared in some soap operas. And so she's someone that people can recognize. And she said that one day when she was closing up shop at one of her salons, a woman came up to her and said, "You have to help me." And she said, she was just like finishing up, closing, after a long day, and said, "What do you mean? And, can you come back tomorrow? And can we make an appointment for you?" And she said, "No, you have to help me. You claim to be a beautician and you go on TV and give beauty tips, and now you have to do something for me." And Musarat Misbah told me that this woman then pulled down a veil from across her face, and Musarat Misbah said that she essentially didn't have a face because she had had acid thrown on her, and a lot of her features were badly burned. She had lost a lot of the cartilage on her face because of the corrosive, power of acid. And so she said that from that day on, she decided that she would do something to help people. These women, mostly 70% of acid burn survivors are women who are dealing with this. And it was really interesting to me that it's so much the opposite of her work, of making women beautiful and thinking about these things and some of the stuff that we think of as really superficial, but she decided that she was going to deal with this population who are not only, perhaps not beautiful, but are not the population she was used to working, are often low-income people, are often grappling with an array of issues as they combat, this new ailment, this new hardship in their lives of having acid thrown on them, but are still really eager to continue on living their lives, but just don't know how. So I met this woman, her name is Bushra Shafi, and she had acid thrown on her by her husband. And I won't get into the details of her story, but it was really, it was like a long-standing issues with abuse. And at the end of the day, she was burned by her husband, and burned in a really horrific way because she had they put a cloth over her head and then poured acid over that, so it stayed on her face for a very long time. She went into a coma, had a lot of damage to her face, her ears, her nose, even issues with her throat and difficulty breathing. So and she said that after that she moved back in with her parents and was afraid to leave the house, was afraid to face people, afraid to face guests, lived in sort of a dark corner, and that was where she was secluded to for a long time until she saw an ad in the paper about the work that Musarat Misbah was doing, calling on acid burn survivors to come to her and promising treatment and promising alternatives and promising really hope to people who had so much hope stripped from them. And so Bushra Shafi went in and interestingly enough, when she was asked what she wanted to do, she said that she wanted to be a beautician. And so you think of someone who for so many years, as Bushra told me, has been afraid to look in a mirror, has been afraid that people would see her on the streets and be afraid of her, called herself a monster because that's what people saw her as, and then became a beautician. And I watched her, give a pedicure to a woman who was like, oh no, can you just file a little bit more, and like, can you like work on this issue? And now she, consults, and she talks to them about getting highlights and cuts hair and, does manis and pedis all day. And I was just like, don't you come in every day and just think how superficial we are of like, oh man, like, my, I've got all these split ends, like my eyebrows are a mess, whatever. But she said, no, she never entertained such feelings. And she said, even when people were afraid of me, I used to thank God for giving me my life and health. And I know that I've been spared and allowed to live another day. And she compared all of these sorts of problems that women come to her with, the hangnails and the split ends, to her own issues, and going to see her plastic surgeon and saying, my throat is still a little bit taut, it's a little constricted, I don't have movement, or can you work on my nose a little bit more? And she's had now dozens of surgeries supported by this Smile Again Foundation started by Musarat Misbah, which has not only helped with medical fees for these women, but helped to place them in jobs. Some of them are working now in burn wards as nurses. Some of them are like Bushra Shafi, working as beauticians, and some are pursuing other ambitions, but really giving hope to these women. And some of them don't want to be out in the open. They don't want to live those lives. And so she's found ways for them to work at home and to do some sort of like handicrafts and that kind of work that will allow them to still be comfortable in their homes, but to earn a living and to develop some kind of independence and a sense of empowerment that comes from being economically sort of stable and economically independent. So I reported this story for Vice on the work of Musarat Misbah and the Smile Again Foundation, and some of the work that she does. And one more thing that I'll say is that she said that a lot of people, she'd have like brides come in to be readied for their big day, or she'd have models come in for shoots, and they would see, acid burn survivors in the salon and see them as a bad omen, for these big moments in their lives. But she would look at them squarely and say, you have choices. You can go elsewhere. You can get your hair cut at any place in this city, but these women can't work elsewhere, and so they're going to stay here. And she's really been an advocate for them and has taken them with her now on talk shows and helped them to find their own voices and to stand up for themselves, which is just remarkable work. I'll go through maybe just one more story. And that is one that I sort of stumbled across when I was in Pakistan. I was interested in PTSD. I spent a lot of time in Peshawar, which is actually where my family is from, and I was interested in the tribal areas, which are just north of Peshawar, and where there have been drone strikes for a long time, and where militancy has been entrenched for a long time, and even areas like Peshawar, which have see bombings a few times a week, if not daily, in the worst of times. And so I was interested in the impact that this has on people, on civilians, on day-to-day lives and livelihoods. And so I went to a psych ward at a big hospital that's actually just in the shadow of a really large fort. It's Lady Reading Hospital in Peshawar. And I was talking to the psychiatrist there about PTSD, and they said, actually, we don't get a lot of cases of PTSD. And actually, I found that was because they're, psychiatrists, psychologists develop specialties, and there were other places that they were going, and I ended up reporting on civilian PTSD through going to other hospitals. But the psychiatrist that I first talked to at Lady Reading Hospital told me that they saw other cases, and they told me some of them, and they mentioned, anxiety and depression and sort of the usual suspects, and then they said conversion disorder, and I'd never heard of conversion disorder. So, I inquired further, asked questions for a living, and so I found that conversion disorder is a psychosomatic disorder that causes, for instance, for this young girl, things like paralysis. This girl is paralyzed, and then left side of her body. But it would cause things like paralysis, like blindness, like seizures. But when these girls, and it affects primarily girls and women, who would come in and they would have, MRIs done, they would have tests done, they would have, eye doctors look at their eyes and they would say, there's nothing wrong with you. You should be able to see. You shouldn't have these seizures. You shouldn't be paralyzed. And so they would, and they weren't faking it. They weren't malingerers. There was something going on, and that something is called conversion disorder. And it's a phenomenon that for a long time, psychologists sort of thought had been rooted out, had been sort of like rooted out at least from developed societies, as there was this increased openness, as there was independence for women especially, and that being able to walk about and to talk about one's problems and all of that would do away, of course, with this like sort of Freudian notion that we bottle things up and they have to go somewhere, they have this impact. And that's what but this phenomenon is really incredibly prevalent. One psychiatrist at Lady Reading told me that he worked for 10 years in the UK and he saw maybe 3 cases of conversion disorder during that time, but in Peshawar at Lady Reading Hospital he could see up to 3 cases a day, and so I don't have like hard numbers, but anecdotally it seems like there's something going on here. So I inquired further, and Mavish Karamat, this great psychologist at Lady Reading Hospital, told me that we have a lot of conversion patients because women are suppressed. The culture is very strict and it's a male-dominated society, so women's rights are violated. Women are bound to the house. That causes them to bury their emotions and develop frustrations. Then they come up with physical symptoms. Sometimes they come up with pain or body aches, and most common with it's fits, which are called conversion fits or non-epileptic fits. So, and in these tribal areas, women and people generally live in family units. They live with their extended family. So even if they have people to talk to, they aren't able to talk openly about their problems because, if you've got an issue with your mother-in-law, you can't tell your sister-in-law necessarily. And so this is part of the issue in areas, where women their mobility is really deeply restricted. But I was interested and so I wanted to find out, like, what is going on? Is this something that's prevalent? Where is it going on then in these sorts of areas, in these societies that are maybe more traditional and restricted, especially for women? And I talked to this neurologist, John Stone, who said that the facts just don't support that it's a nice idea that societies where people can express themselves would mean that it gets bottled up and becomes a physical symptoms. But he said, I don't think the evidence supports it. And while there's some evidence, that there aren't really broad-scale cross-cultural studies of conversion disorder. And so it raises a lot of questions, and in some ways it raises questions about the disconnect that we have between the mind and body, and how we separate these things, and also how we separate these phenomenons of psychological issues and bodily issues in ways that, and Mavish, one other thing that she told me that she thought was interesting was, like, when her own mother is stressed about something, she doesn't sit down with her and say, and she's a psychologist, she doesn't say, like, hey, I'm really stressed today, I've got a lot of anxiety. She says, I have a splitting headache today. And so she was saying that maybe this is just the vocabulary, and this is just like how women find it acceptable to talk about these things, or maybe they don't talk about them unless they become manifest in physical issues. And so that's sort of fueling some of these things in places like Pakistan, where there isn't really a culture of psychologizing and diagnosing, mental illness, and where there's like very few psychologists and psychiatrists around to begin with. And so there is this disconnect between the mind and body, and I think it connects in interesting ways in Pakistan, especially in the tribal areas. But also this points to sort of this disconnect between the mind and body in terms of how it's studied. And so maybe a neurologist would say that it doesn't add up and the numbers don't add up, but that a psychiatrist or a psychologist would look at it differently. And really conversion disorder sort of falls into this liminal space and this in-between zone between the mind and the body. And so there isn't as much work being done to study it, and that was something that that I thought was worth exploring and interesting to study further. I'll just give one more story, and then I'll stop. And that's This is actually bringing it full circle because this is one of the first stories that I ever reported as a journalist. And it was during the height of the Arab Spring when there were, just hundreds and hundreds of people in Tahrir Square and protesting across Egypt. And I was really interested because I was, as someone who follows world events closely, I wasn't, even really a journalist at this point, but I followed international affairs, and I was interested because I didn't know a lot about Egypt, but one thing that I was aware of was that sexual harassment and sexual violence are really entrenched in Egyptian society. And so I was interested in hearing all these reports about women in spending days and days in Tahrir Square, spending nights there, taking their children there. And I was wondering about how they could do that, how they felt safe doing that, and why they felt that it was worth perhaps the risk of making themselves vulnerable in order to do that. And so I just, I used the connections I had. I had a family friend who's Egyptian and, not even from Cairo, but I was like, hey, do you know anyone in Tahrir Square? And he said, like, yeah, my sister-in-law's there. So then I, got on Skype and I talked to her, and this was really just to fuel my own curiosity in the beginning, to figure out, like, what are the women doing there and why are they there? And so this woman, Elham Idarus, told me, this is a revolutionary moment in the development of our society. The situation of harassment in this country will depend on many things. If Egypt becomes more democratic, more free, if there is more deterrence for such crimes, more police enforcement, maybe the problem of sexual harassment will cease. And so what I learned from her and other women in the square was that the revolution was really tied to their own empowerment. Was all about empowerment, of course, and overthrowing a dictator who had brutally ruled Egypt for decades. But for a lot of women, that meant reclaiming their own space in society, and that was something that I thought was interesting and worth highlighting. And so that ended up becoming one of the first stories that I reported, and it was featured in the American Prospect. So I think, and I guess I'll just say that's one, I think maybe you've gotten a sense of this now, but so much of what fuels me as a journalist is just a sense of curiosity and just reading the news with a critical eye and wondering what are stories that aren't being reported, and what are these phenomena and like how can I get at them, and trying to just follow my own curiosity to its natural end, and then hoping then of course that my editors will think that the thing I'm curious about is also worth wondering about, worth asking questions about, worth writing about or reporting on, and also hoping then that readers and news consumers will find it interesting as well. So I think that's really at the core of what I do, and I really feel grateful to be in a profession where I can just like be curious and continually be learning about places all over the world. So I'll leave it there and welcome any questions that you have about my work, or maybe about like how one gets to be a journalist. Because another thing that I told a lot of the classrooms that I spoke to today was that when I was in college, I didn't study journalism to begin with, and I never met someone who was an international journalist who reported on international issues. So I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what that looked like. I didn't know how one got into that. And so, as someone who's doing that now, I welcome any questions about that, because I think sometimes it does seem far away, and we'll see like some like hardened reporters on TV, and you don't get a sense of the challenges and sort of their early steps in taking up that line of work. So I'd be willing to answer any questions about that, or about my work specifically and some of the stories I highlighted.
To work. Okay, I think it's on. If you have questions, I'm going to bring a mic actually around to you so that you can be heard. But I just want to say before I do that, I just want to thank you very much again for coming. I'm amazed at the strength of some of the people and the stories that you're discussing. But I also want to say that how amazed I am at your strength too. The emotional toll it has to take to cover some of the types of stories that you're covering, and to not take the easy route and go work for mainstream media, but rather chase the various sources of funding you have to chase in order to get you around the world and do the things that you do to let you follow your passion. And I respect that very much, and I assure you, I guarantee that I will continue to draw on your stories in the courses that I teach.
Thank you.
Questions? Any questions for Beenish? Actually, if anyone would help Jeff, if you'd take maybe another mic, and in case there's other questions, we'll go on two sides of the room.
Hi. I'm curious, what do you think, do you think that it's easier as a female reporter to either gain access or sort of gain sort of the trust of the people that you're talking with, and to tell the stories that you have told? Do you think it makes a difference that you are a female versus, say, a male reporter going into these same situations?
That's a really good question. I mean, it's hard to know because I am a female reporter, right? I'm not a male reporter, so. But I would think that, you know, I'm asking really sensitive questions, and, you know, I'm really pushing it for answers on some really sensitive issues, and so I wonder if there is sort of a trust that's built, or maybe an openness that comes from being a woman and in talking to women about some of these issues. And that's, and especially in, you know, in places like Pakistan, which, you know, I spent the most time in, so I can speak to that more than other places. But, you know, like, these aren't necessarily things that people talk about openly. These aren't things that come up that much oftentimes. And so the root of some of these issues, like, for instance, that girl who was suffering from conversion disorder, one of the psychologists thought that perhaps it all began for her, you know, I'm sorry, actually it wasn't the girl in the photos, it was another girl that we targeting. And so, and so those are like issues that, like, people don't talk about openly, and you know, you can see the consequences of that, perhaps even for that one individual, of bottling it all up and having to find some out and not having an out. And so I do wonder if it makes it easier as a woman, and I think in some ways, I guess I would assume so. You know, I would have to assume so. But I think that also there's a level, there's a lot of things that you do to build trust. And what I do as a journalist, like, I spend a lot of time with people. I think sometimes, like, I think, or I'll, like, tell people who are waiting on me that, you know, I'll just do a quick, like, 20-minute interview or a half-hour interview or even an hour interview. But for me, I spend a lot of time with people. I sit and I talk to them, and I don't necessarily start by asking the big questions. I spend a lot of time talking to them about their lives, about where they live, about what they do, about what they like to do, to develop a sense of trust. And I'm willing to be open about my own life and where I'm from and what I do, because I'm asking people I'm speaking to be very, very open and vulnerable with me. And so if they ask me, it's not like I make it all about me, but if they ask me questions in response, there are moments when they're like, you know, well, who are you? And why should I tell you these things? And so there is that pushback even as a woman. And so I'll tell them a little bit about myself and why I'm interested. And other than that, I should say that, you know, what I think of more in some instances is that sometimes when I spoke to government officials, for instance, or people who are kind of power brokers, I think that they didn't necessarily think, you know, they didn't necessarily think that I was that threatening, maybe because I was a woman, and so they were willing to be more open with me and tell me things that maybe they wouldn't. I mean, I don't know, but maybe that they wouldn't tell a male reporter because I was just like some little girl, right? And so I think maybe it does work to one's benefit, but I think that there is a lot that you can do as a journalist to build trust, and that's not necessarily dependent on who you are, because there are so many things that divide us, but there's so much that's also that's similar in that you can find points of connection on. And I was always really, you know, pleased when those moments of connection would come up, even in small ways. So.
Other questions?
One thing we know from looking at different social movements is that when people usually challenge the status quo or the hierarchy that exists, there's a lot of negative pushback, sometimes in terms of violence. Now, in terms of, and it was manifest in a lot of the stories you discussed, I was struck by the Malawi story because it seemed like that was different than all those other ones. How are the tribal elders in that situation reacting to these 10, 12, 14-year-old girls pushing back on their established norms?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a long-standing process, and I think those conversations are ones that they've had, that they are having, that they continue to have. But I think that in that instance specifically, they were able to cause some to make some shifts, and they were well received, even though they were, it was a big ask. It's a big ask to say, like, let's leave this all behind. And one thing that I thought was fascinating that Faith told me is that the people who were the most opposed to these shifts were the, I think they're called Anakungwe, I'm not sure of the word, but the women elders from the villages where this happens, who are leading the initiations because they have a financial stake in them. They get paid by the parents to initiate these girls. And so the biggest pushback came from them, because I think that in some regards, while the men may know what's going on, they weren't as intimately involved, and they didn't have as much of a stake in the phenomenon. And so sometimes these things the pushback is unexpected. It's not from where you think. You would think that as a woman or as a mother, you would be able to recognize that these are harmful and really hurtful practices for individuals and even on a community level. One thing I didn't mention about that story, which is perhaps the most shocking and hard part of it, is that after the girls were initiated, they were expected to have sex to seal their initiations, to fully to be initiated. And they were presented, they would do the dances that they were taught at a village ceremony, and then they were supposed to sort of like picked by men in the village to, who would take their virginities. And oftentimes when they weren't, there would be bands of men who would travel through the villages who were called hyenas, who were then employed by the parents to sleep with these very young girls and paid to do so. So, you would think that parents and as parents that's like something that's really harmful, but these are centuries old traditions. This is something that's gone on for a long time, and so pushing back, as you say, is hard. And it's hard because those traditions are entrenched, but it's also hard because there are continuing financial stakes and continuing sorts of power stakes in them. And so, and so I think that there's a work that they do and sort of it's not like a one-time conversation, I would think. And and there are village elders in Malawi. I met one in particular who was doing like work and talking to other chiefs, other tribal chiefs, to help get them on board in promoting safe sex practices and in pushing back against early marriage and in early childbirth. And so it's not just like these girls up against a system that has existed long before them, but there's other people who are fighting for this. And now Malawi has instituted a new law that raises the age at which girls can be married, and so these things are happening on a broader scale as well.
Other questions?
Beenish.
Hi.
I really appreciate the fact that you tell and you cover with such passion the untold stories. So I was wondering, in your estimation, what the next issue is, the next thing that we should be focusing on, the untold story, particularly about women and children, that the media is not yet seeing and that you're just becoming aware of. That's a fair question.
Well, I mean, I don't have like I said, it's so often it's like you are surprised by things as a journalist. And you have to let yourself be open to what the story is. Maybe the story isn't what you thought it was, and being flexible in letting that shift is really important as a journalist. And so I don't necessarily know, and that's why I think reporting from the field is really important, because when you're not out there, sometimes it's like you're just working off of what's already been researched, what's already been out there. And so I think that, while there's been a lot of work academically, I found after the fact on initiation, there aren't a lot of journalists reporting on it. And so, but I think broadly, the issue of sexual violence, it's an obvious one, but I think it's a huge one. I mean, we look at how the UVA scandal and the subsequent fallout to the Rolling Stone article has fueled controversy and conversations around this country. And there's very similar things happening all over the world, like the rape of that the student in Delhi on a bus, like that. That happened, and that sparked similar conversations. Yeah, and then in November in Nigeria, there was a woman who was stripped and in public at a bus stop, and it led to this sort of like mini skirt march of reclaiming, and reclaiming in ways that happen in India, that's happening now in the United States, reclaiming a space for women and reclaiming a space for women to. Claiming a space for women to dress as they please and to push back against rape culture. And I think that's like, I mean, it's hard sometimes to make trends, but I think that's like that's a trend that's going on around the world, and that a lot of that's being ignited all over the world. And sadly, maybe it's just a matter of there's more attention that's being given to it now than ever before. But I think that's like. That's a really core issue, and really at the core of so much, at the core of girls' education. If a girl can't get to school because of a fear of sexual violence, or after sexual violence occurs to her, then that's altering her life in drastic ways. And so I think that's really just ensuring the basic safety of women is just primary, and I guess that's what I would say.
Hey, I
Hi.
see that a lot of your work was in the alternative press. When you're looking for news, do you go to both alternative and mainstream media sources?
Yeah, I do kind of a broad swath. So I should say now I'm based in Washington, D.C. I work at Think Progress, and I try to do as much reporting. I do a lot of reporting now from D.C. on international issues still. And so I do like read a lot of sort of the mainstream press, the traditional kind of big newspapers, and look at breaking news and all the rest of it. But I am interested in the spaces that are being opened up by new media sources, and how they're sort of shifting the focus and reporting stories that maybe weren't seen as the kinds of stories that were worth reporting by the big guys. So I am interested in that, but more and more I'm trying, as someone who's trying to report ground realities and untold stories from places that I'm not in and perhaps have never visited. I rely on a lot of local media, and so I read and kind of track local media, and sometimes it's through social media, Twitter and the like, but also local newspapers, because there are journalists on the ground in places that have a lot of these big media organizations have scaled back their presence in places around the world that are not big in the moment, that aren't sort of like that the United States may not have a stake in, for instance, as much as others. And so I follow local sources as well, because they are covering these things, and maybe they aren't projecting them out to the world, but they're stories that are still worth projecting out in the world to understand what life is like for people around the world.
Any other questions before we start to wrap up for the evening?
Hi. Well, that was too loud. I'm actually a journalism major, and also my second major is international relations. And I was totally blown away by your work, because I've always wanted to do stuff like that. And it's exactly what you said. It's so hard to find people that actually do that kind of work and figure out where do you go with this, where do you, like internships and everything. But I guess my question is, which has always gotten to me because I've always been passionate about social injustices and human rights, is why do these stories become untold stories and not included in our media agenda today?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's hard to say. You know, I'll speak to it's the reason I went to. I'll just answer sort of through my own sense of this, but because I went to Pakistan because I wanted to report on what I knew was going on in the country. My family is Pakistani. I spent basically every other summer of my life in Pakistan. So, and the Pakistan I saw in the news was not the Pakistan that I knew, and the people that I saw in the news representing Pakistan were not sort of the everyday people that I knew, and the struggles they represented. It just didn't add up to me, and so I went there and I learned, you know, and the problem in a place like Pakistan, for instance, is that the Western media there, so Reuters, the AP, the New York Times, the BBC, all of these reporters for these organizations are covering whatever blows up in Pakistan, whether that's a bombing or whether that's like a political blow up, right? And that's a full-time job. There's something going on all of the time. And, you know, I had lunch enough times with reporters who had to like duck out and leave because, yes, another something had blown up. And that wasn't the kind of reporting that I wanted to do, because I was interested in how people are living despite that, and how the issues that they face on a day-to-day basis that might be more troubling to them and more real to them and have more of an impact on their day-to-day lives than militancy. If you're an acid burn survivor, that's your problem. You know, that's a sort of terror upon you. That's a kind of terrorism that's wrought upon you that's not getting covered because it's not traditionally seen as terrorism. But, you know, that's something that terrorizes hundreds of women in Pakistan every year. And so that's something that I wanted to report. And unfortunately, because of the structure of media and how sort of foreign bureaus operate and the stories that are deemed to be the biggest stories, those stories go untold. And I think that's my best guess at the reason for it. But I found that some of the stories that I've reported on that are related to these like sort of core issues about health, about personal safety, and you know, about earning an income and getting by after your school is shut down, really have gained traction, because I think that's what humanizes people. I think it's hard to relate to a place when all you know about it is that it's bullet riddled and that there's a bombing day in, day out, and you know, how do you relate to that? But I think these core issues are what tie us, and so I think that those stories do help to inform our understanding of a place, perhaps far more than what makes the headlines. And that's why I think it's important, and I'm really pleased that sort of alternative media, as you dubbed it, as one of the people asked the question dubbed it, are addressing some of those things, because I think that's what really helps us make sense of our world and to build the connections we need to feel like we are interconnected, and that have a sense of how things are going on and what the future is like for us all.
Would you join me one more time in thanking Beenish Ahmed for being here tonight? Oh, and there's cookies and some drinks and stuff in the back too if you want to stick around.
I hope I haven't ruined your appetite.